All right, so here's the feature we're going to add. We want to make it so when the user clicks on the create entry button, it takes us to a different page that allows us to type information in to create our journal entry about the habit of mind we're demonstrating like in class today. Okay. Um, We've done some elements of this before, right? Because we've done like event listeners on like the click events for buttons and written JavaScript code for that. So we're going to do something very similar, but we also now are going to be communicating with a web server instead of just like changing something on the client side. So that's going to be the different part of it. So to kind of give you an overview of this, here's what's going to be happening. Again, on the left side is Chrome. That's our client side. On the right side is Node. That's our server side. And I have a dash line here down the middle. Um, on the client, when we're on the slash page, it's not really it's kind of like slash index, right? That's the EJS file. It's going, when we click the button, it's going to send an HTTP GET request to the server, okay? And it's going to try to get slash create entry. This is a different path, a different endpoint. Our node server inside of router.js is going to send back, it's going to do a render on the create entry.ejs file, render that file, and send that HTML back to the client. Okay, so this is the communication happening between Chrome, the client, and Node, the server, when this create entry button is pressed. Once we're on the create entry page, it's going to be like a web form, and we're going to fill out information about the habit of mind stuff. When the user clicks on the submit button on the create entry page, we, on the client side, we're going to do what's called a fetch command. Okay, a fetch command is a way of communicating to the server from within JavaScript. And this is going to be the primary way that we communicate to our web server within client-side JavaScript. So we're going to do a fetch slash create entry, which is really similar to this, except our method will now be a post instead of a get. We don't want to get the create entry page. We want to post, we want to send our data to the create entry endpoint instead, and we put all our data inside this body property. Router.js will receive all of that. It will save it in MongoDB, and then it will send back a 201 response, which is like, I accept your data. It's all good. When the client-side JavaScript code in createentry.js, which we'll write, receives that response, it then sets the window location to slash, which returns us to the home page. So this is a technique we're going to use a lot. We have data to send to the server. We do a fetch with a post. Data goes to the server responds with like 201 to accept it. We then change what page we're on the client side, to go back to, in this case, the index page. So we have a few things to put together to pull this off, but we're going to kind of build it up step by step. Let's start in the EJS page. Let's add more stuff to our home page here, our index page. Let's make it look better. So let's add like a graphic. So I'm going to do an IMG tag, and the source is going to be IMG slash SE dash, I don't remember. Let's see. Let's look at the folder here, because now we have our static assets. So it's SE dash GitHub dash image dot PNG. I'm going to set our alt text to the Husky code logo. Always good to specify that alt property. So for screen readers and things, it can describe what the image is. Our width is going to be 100 pixels. Our height is going to be 100 pixels. Cool. And that's what that image will look like. Let's also add an H1 that says Habits of Mind Journal. So it'll look a little bit more like a real web page. So we have our logo, we have a header, And then before the footer and after this main block, we'll add a script because we're going to need some JavaScript code for the button to work. So we'll say source equals, src equals. It's in the JS folder, and we'll call it, index.js. So 3 changes: add an image, add a header, include the script. We haven't written this file yet. It's not going to work yet, but we will. Let's create this file. So it's in the JS directory. JS folder is called index.js. So inside of assets, I'll click on JS. I'll click on the plus button. I'll type index.js. Make sure it's actually in the right folder. I get confused with this file explorer and VS Code at times, and I end up creating files in the wrong place. When you do that, when I do that, I can just drag them into the folder I want. So if index.js ended up in the wrong level, I can drag it into the JS folder, but it's got to be in this folder because that's the static asset path we specified with Express. All right, so let's write some familiar JavaScript code. This file contains client-side JavaScript function, contains a client-side JavaScript function, or contains client-side JavaScript functions, maybe. Primarily, event handlers to fetch data from the node server. That's most of what the JavaScript we write does. A lot of what we've been doing the last couple of days is like totally new. Good news is this will be familiar and comforting because we're going to use our query selector methods that we've learned about previously, and we're going to use the add event listener method that we learned about previously. So I'm going to create a variable here called create entry button. And on my document, I'm going to call query selector. And the technique we learned to do this is we specify the element tag type button, and then a dot and the name of the class. Now that I have a reference to the button on that variable, I can call add event listener. And I want it to listen for the click event. GitHub Copilot is not super helpful here. We're going to do this differently. We're simply going to redirect the client, meaning the browser, to the create entry path. And the way we do that is, just like this. Window.location equals create entry. There are many ways to connect a function as an event handler for a button to get to a different page. I am showing you just one. Okay, so my goal throughout these couple of weeks in this unit is not to show you all the ways it can be done, but to show you one way that is fairly common and straightforward. I'm not saying it's necessarily the best way. I'm sure front-end developers argue incessantly about what the best way is, but this will work, and I think it's relatively straightforward to understand. So when the button is clicked, the function here will run, and it will change the location property of our browser window to create entry. Cool. That's what we need. So we've now connected some JavaScript code to our button that's on our web page. And so we just kind of keep going through the process. We think about, okay, what's the next step, right? So we've now connected our button to JavaScript code. We're changing the location to create entry. Oh, we need to add code to our router to handle this new entry point, this new endpoint. We need to handle the create entry endpoint. So now we switch back to router.js. Here is the code that handles our index page, the root of our website. We just need to add another one. Okay. So we're going to call the get method on the route for create entry. So that looks pretty good. So this is exactly the same as what we wrote on line 7 here, except now the endpoint is different. Instead of just slash, it's slash create entry. And we're simply going to call render on the create entry EJS file. So now when the web client requests, sends an HTTP GET command to the create entry endpoint, we render the create entry EJS file and send that HTML back to the client. So in terms of our picture, we're on this step right here, right? We click the button, HTTP get slash create entry. We just added this endpoint. We called render. We're going to send the HTML back once we write the create entry EJS file. That's our next step. So let's do that. Let's create the create entry EJS file. So I'm going to actually go to the index EJS file first and copy this. I'm going to copy the whole file here because there's a lot of stuff here that's the same. And so that's going to give me a little bit of a head start when I create my new EJS file called create entry.ejs. I'm going to paste all of that in. So I have the stuff here for the header. I have the main site here with the image and the title. We might move this into the header file, maybe something for us to consider about in the future, because I just copy and pasted like all the same code here. But we definitely don't want this button here. We'll get rid of that. And we'll put other code here instead. We're going to need to include a different JavaScript file. So we're going to create one called createentry.js. So we'll change that. The footer looks good. So let's just, after the header, let's add the form that we want the user to fill out for their habit of buying thing. We aren't going to use the form HTML element that GitHub Copilot is recommending here. We're simply going to put all of our controls inside of a div, and we're going to use JavaScript to get the information we want. There's nothing wrong with HTML forms. We're just taking a different approach that I think you're going to find a little bit more straightforward and a little bit more flexible as we build more sophisticated apps. So we're going to use the label tag to specify a label for a control, something that the user can type stuff in. Our first control will be the date, so we'll label it date. And then inside the label tag, we're going to do input, and the type of the input is a date, and the class is a date, and then we close that tag. And we're going to use the same format for each control. We'll have a label tag. Inside the label, we'll have an input of different types, and we'll always specify a class. So in our JavaScript code, we can extract that data and send it to the server. So our next label, you spell it right? Our next label is going to be habit of mind. And our input type is going to be text. And our class is going to be HOM for habit of mind. That's where they can type like thinking flexibly. Then we will label and have something called journal entry. That's where they can type like their journal entry. That is an input. It's called text area if we want to write like a block of text. And we'll still need a class for that. content. We can have some default text there. Excuse me. I'm just going to say my journal entry, and that's what the user can replace. And then finally, we just need a submit button. And we do this through another input. And we say type equals submit, class equals submit, value equals submit. That'll be the label on the button. Um, a submit input doesn't need a label because it will get the text right on the button itself. And that's what our form will look like, our fields will look like that the user will fill in to create their journal entry. So we're going to pause here and we'll pick this up tomorrow. Our last step to make this actually work is to write the JavaScript code in createentry.js, which we haven't created yet, and send that off to the web server. All right, so picking up where we left off, we have an EJS file with all the different controls where the user will type their journal entry, but we need to actually make the submit button do something. And so we have to implement this createentry.js file. So all of our client-side JavaScript files are inside of the assets.js folder. So I'm going to click on that, click on the new file button, and type createentry.js. Oh, great question. Yeah, that's good to. So we just can do, I mean, why can we just do slash JS? The reason for that is we told Express that all JavaScript files inside of the folder slash JS are actually stored inside of the folder assets.js on the server side. So we've created this mapping from the endpoint that we use on the client side to where it is on the server. Excellent question. All right, so in here, let's look at index.js. This is like really similar-ish. All right, let's copy this code, and then we're going to modify it. So copy all the code from index.js and paste it into createentry.js. And then we'll modify it because we're still doing a similar thing. We still need to add an event listener to the click event on the button, but we want the submit button. So let's change this variable to be called submit button. And we'll do document.query selector. I don't remember what we called it. Let's look it up. Our button, not index, create entry. The class, so it's of type input and the class is submit. So in the JavaScript code, our selector will be input.submit, the element type, and then the class name. All right, and then we'll say submit button dot add event listener on click. That's all good. But we want to do something different. We want to get the values entered by the user. So we need to get all the stuff. So what's all the stuff? We need the date, the habit of mind, and the journal entry. So let's write code for each of those. So I'm going to say const date equals document.query selector input.date.value. That looks good. So we're doing the query selector method again. We're querying for an input element of class date. So remember yesterday, here's our input element here. It's of class date. So this will get the date that the user has specified. And then I'm immediately doing dot value because I don't really care about a reference to the control. I want the actual value that the user typed in. So I'm doing it all on one line of code. And then we're going to do the same thing for the habit of mind that they selected or that they typed in. So habit of mind equals document.query selector input dot, what class did we use? HOM. So I'm going to copy and paste that so I don't mess it up. And we'll get that value. And then there's the content of their journal entry. So I'm just going to say content equals document query selector. Let's see what that is. All right, the content is of element type text area, and the class is content. So we have to have query selector text area dot content dot value. Eventually, we're going to want to store all this data in MongoDB. We'll work our way up to that. For now, let's just log it to the console so we can see it in the client-side console that all this data was read. So I'm just going to say console.log date plus, I don't know, a semicolon, and then the habit of mind, and another semicolon, and the content. And then for now, we're simply going to redirect to the home page. Oh, we'll say windows.location. That works fine. We're going to redirect to the home page. So we're not actually saving anything in the database yet, but we are building out all the code to send a web page to the client with all of the fields, let the user type in all their information, hit the submit button, read all those values, and yes, eventually we'll send it to the server, but for now, first step is just to log it to the console. So let's actually make sure this looks good. So I'm going to switch here. I stopped my server after class yesterday, so I'm going to switch and start the server again. I'm going to look at my debug console to make sure it was successful and I see server started. And then I'll switch over and try the client. There we go. So here's the client page. If I hit create entry, I got nothing. Oh, there. Oh, it's just slow. Okay. There's create entry. So here's the fields. We saw this yesterday, but today I should be able to. The submit button was a yesterday thing. Oops. My page is very not responsive. Can I do this? I can type here, thinking flexibly. Flexibly. Today I debugged my create entry page. But why can't I? Oh, there it is. All right, so December 4th. Great. So when I hit submit, it should take me back to the main page. That's good. And if I look in the client debug console, well, I don't see it there. Let's see if I see it here. Inspect, console. Oh, here's a cool tip I'll show you. We logged stuff to the console and it's gone. Okay, because we went to another page, and every time you go to another page, it clears your console in Chrome. But you can configure that. You can click on the little gear icon in the console for Chrome, and you can say preserve log. And then if I create another entry, I enable the preserve log console feature and hit submit. Then we can actually see what we logged to the console and then that we navigated to the root page. So I usually like enabling the preserve log feature because otherwise I get confused like, why aren't my messages there? And it's just that they've been cleared because I went to a different page. So on the other hand, you have to be careful that if you're like running code over and over again, you don't get confused that some of the stuff might be really far in the past. You can always press this button, the little like circle with a line through it to clear your console as well, just to get rid of the old stuff. All right, I don't know why I stopped all those. That's okay.